Hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Robert, and welcome back to Sound Strategies. Today we're going to be talking about how to make something sound older, how to give your sounds that classic vintage vibe. So I've got 4 tips for you today. I'm going to talk about them and then we'll demonstrate them together. And to help you recall these tips for your future productions, I've prepared a How to Make Anything Sound Older cheat sheet, which you can download for free in the description below. So remember to grab that after the video. So to preface this video, we'll discuss some differences between vintage analog tracking and modern digital recording. And then we can go on to talk about how to replace what's missing from that vintage vibe. So to start, there's not as many microphones being used. Microphones naturally inject their own character onto the signal. So using different microphone techniques and positioning can drastically change the makeup of the recording sound. So where we place the microphone in the room will change the result of the audio. Which brings us to the second aspect. If there's no microphones, there's no room. When we record a MIDI instrument, there's no space between the performance and the recording. We're using samples that somebody else has recorded, and you're limited to the sounds that you've got in your library. Now, of course, this is a trade-off of convenience. The samples that we use today sound really, really good, even the stock ones in your DAW. And when we compare them to much older recordings, they almost sound too clear. Much of the stuff that was recorded decades ago was a bit more blurry and not as clear. Which brings us to the third difference in the signal path. There's not a lot of flavor that's being added on the way in. What we put in is what we get out, and that's the main feature of digital audio. But in analog world, that's not what we want. We like that our gear does cool stuff, that it imprints its characteristic onto our sounds, and it makes them different. That's the whole fun of engineering audio. So having said that, let's check out something really old. I'm going to go way back so that the comparison is very obvious. So I've got a song loaded up here by Robert Johnson. It's called 3220 Blues, and this song was recorded in 1936 in San Antonio, Texas, in Johnson's hotel room. His producer Don Law set up some recording equipment in the room to track a number of his songs. And hey, if Robert Johnson can record classic tunes in his own room, so can you. So let's have a listen.
I sent for my baby and she don't come. I sent for my baby and she don't come. All the doctors in Hot Springs.
Now the sound of this recording is very focused on the mid-range. We can see from the frequency analyzer there isn't much information going on above around 5 or 6 kilohertz. And everything below about a 100 hertz is essentially just rumble and noise. So even if there was bass on this record, those lower frequencies weren't as prominent in these older recordings. There's just not a lot of articulate information going on down there. And that's the first thing that we can do to make something sound a lot older. Filter out the highs and the lows of the recording. Start by cutting out everything below about 100 to 200 hertz and everything above 5 to 7 kilohertz to focus the sound more on the mid-range. The second thing we can do is add some saturation. This is also known as harmonic distortion, and it adds extra harmonic information to the sound, which gives it more flavor and attitude. So adding a tape, tube, or vinyl emulation to your sound can help mimic the expensive recording technology of the past. Analog modeled compressors are also great for adding a bit of color. Crank up the drive and dirty it up as you please. The third tip is reverb. A nice charactered reverb can add some extra life and glow to your sounds. Start by trying out a mono, plate, or spring reverb because these were the earliest types of artificial reverbs that were available. And then again, filter the frequency response to focus on the mid-range. And when possible, use mono. Stereo wasn't around until much later, so mono is definitely the way to go for a vintage sound. If you don't have a mono reverb, you can insert a stereo widening plugin and reduce the width to 0. And lastly, automation. This isn't limited to make something sound vintage, but it definitely helps to make the part sound more organic and convincing if that's your goal. Automation adds movement, and what this does is first it simulates imperfect gear. Imagine recording with an older microphone or on an old recording desk. Everything's not always perfect. Gear malfunctions, and if there's a resistor or a component that's about to fail, the voltage might fluctuate just a bit. And it might give you a subtle difference in volume over time. So that's one reason. The second reason is that automation helps to shut off our analytical brain. When you first listen to something, say a mix that your friend wants some feedback on, you may be skeptical at first. You're searching for what needs to be adjusted, looking to give feedback. So what automation does is by subtly adjusting the volume, it helps everything fit together more naturally. You may go, oh, the bass is too loud, but then a moment later it falls back into the mix. Or, oh, that snare is buried. Oh wait, there it is. And what this does is after a while, our analytical brain shuts off. We can just enjoy it as great music. So using automation on volume or the filtering that we were talking about earlier, or the amount and intensity of saturation or compression will add some extra life and breath to your tracks as they live and move together more organically. So now let's put these techniques to action and make some old sounding beats. So in this beat, I've got 3 or 4 main components. I've got some drums and percussion. I've got a string ensemble, and then I've got a sample here, a little bass line, and some horn fills. So I'm going to play this beat as it is right now, and then we're going to go through some of the techniques that we talked about to make it sound older. Okay, cool. So it sounds pretty modern right now. So if I open up the mix window, the first thing that we can do is add some filtering. So I've done that on the sample itself. I've done that on the drum bus, and I've also done that with the strings. So what I've done here is I've took out the highs, I've took out the lows, and I've added a sort of resonant peak around 2K, and this is going to help give it that nasally kind of resonance that's present in older recordings. So let's listen to the difference that that makes. So that focuses it more on the mid-range, makes it sound a lot more vintage. The next thing we can do is add saturation, and I've done this in a couple different places. I've got a saturation knob going on the kick and snare. I've got some Kramer master tape, tape saturation going on the sample, on the drums, and then also on the strings. And I love this plugin because you can dial in the amount of tape saturation and distortion. You can also add in some wow and flutter and some tape noise, which is really gonna make it authentic and less clean. You can also stack saturation. So on the strings here, I've got a Kramer tape as well as the saturation knob, just turned up a little bit. And then on the drum bus, I've also got a CLA2A compressor and a Pugue Child compressor. And I love these. They're analog modeled compressors. And on the Pugue Child, I've just turned up the input gain just a little bit to drive it, give it a little bit more color. Another thing that you can do, this is another plugin, the H delay. And on this, I've put an 1/8 note delay on our a sample. It's an Apple loop, the Brooklyn Nights synth. And I've also put in a little bit of modulation. And this mimics the wow and flutter of old tape recording. I've also filtered it, and it makes a pretty convincing sound to it. So there's a lot more flavor happening. I just want to solo this sample that I'm using, the Brooklyn Nights synth, and I want to show you before and after the Kramer tape and the H delay. So it's a little bit more grainy, a bit more lo-fi. And it's adding a bit more of that character to it. So what I've done here, I've got an 1/8 note delay, I've got the lo-fi setting on, and I've filtered it, and I've put a little bit of modulation on it. The next thing that we can do is add in a mono plate reverb. So I've got the Abbey Road plates here. I really like this one because you can adjust the amount of high end, the amount of low end, the pre-delay, the wet dry. It's got a drive knob and an analog modeling feature to it. So it's an all-in-one plugin. And then after that, I've put in the Waves S1 imager, and I've put the width to 0, which is going to make it mono. So let's have a listen to that. I've got that sending to the sample, the trumpet, and then also the strings as well. bit more life, a bit more room to it. And the last thing that we can do, I've already actually done here. You can see on our drum track, I've got a little bit of modulation, a little bit of automation going on with the low cut. So I've cut out the high frequencies, but I've also just kind of modulated that filter a little bit so it moves in and out. You can do that with volume, you can do that with the amount of saturation, and I've got a little bit of a volume and a low cut here, modulation going on that can lead into a drop or a transition or something like that. So we're going to compare the track with and without the processing to see the difference. So this processing makes everything sound a lot less modern, much more grainy and focused on the mid-range, which are notable characteristics of vintage recordings. So using these techniques together is guaranteed to make your tracks sound older and feature more of that classic vintage color and vibe. So make sure to download the cheat sheet in the description below to recall these techniques for your future productions. And let me know in the comments if you have any extra tips for adding a bit of that vintage sparkle. So thanks for watching this video and keep making great music.